I don't think that I'd really I do that every episode now.
What's that?
I gesticulate a lot, and
okay.
occasionally
You're
I just whack the mic.
You're okay.
But no, I can't remember what I was saying.
Hello, and welcome to A Century in Cinema. My name is Arthur.
My name is Andrew.
And this is a podcast where we watch and discuss a classic film from every year. This year we're in 1957, taking a look at a Soviet film, The Cranes Are Flying, from director Mikhail Kalatozov. Am I pronouncing that right?
I always say Kalatozov, but again, we will be mispronouncing every name.
Yes, sorry to our Russian listeners.
Mm-hmm.
For any new listeners, you can find where our movies are streaming or available to rent online in the link in our show notes. If you're listening and enjoying the show, drop us a rating on Apple Podcasts. Write a little something nice. We appreciate it. It helps new listeners find the show on the charts, and it lets us know how we're doing. So thank you. So we're in the year 1957.
Ooh.
The Soviet Union launches Sputnik 1, the first space satellite. And later on in the year, they launch Sputnik 2, the first satellite carrying an animal, a dog named Laika. And I didn't do my research, but I'm pretty sure Laika didn't survive.
That would be sad. But, history's a little sad sometimes.
Very sad, almost all the time.
Mm-hmm.
The US also attempts to launch their own satellite this year, but it explodes in a moment of humiliation. Just next year in January, the US will launch their own satellite, Explorer 1. But for now, the Soviet Union has the only satellite in space. This is considered to be the beginning of the space race, but we could realistically say the space race began way back around World War II with Germany's V-2 rockets, long-range ballistic missiles. Now, in Little Rock, Arkansas, federal troops are sent in to enforce integration in public schools. This is the famous Little Rock 9. And in South Vietnam, Viet Cong guerrilla fighters begin terrorist bombings and assassinations. What was the big events for this year?
Fantastic. We talk about movies real quick?
Yeah. Let's talk about what came out in 1957.
Banger year. Oh my gosh. Two of the directors who we've been sort of following throughout this process release one of my favorite films from each of them. Federico Fellini releases Nights of Cabiria, which is my all-time favorite Fellini film. It makes me cry like a baby every time I watch it. I think it is one of the most sensitive and emotional films ever put to screen, and everybody should watch it. And Ingmar Bergman releases The Seventh Seal this year, which is considered by many to be his masterpiece. I definitely consider it to be one of them. It is a fantastic film about the ongoing inner battle between ourselves and our own mortality. Kurosawa releases Throne of Blood this year, his adaptation of Macbeth. And the all-time classic 12 Angry Men is released this year, which is considered one of the great morality debates within cinema. Without details, a few other great films that come out: Sweet Smell of Success, Witness for the Prosecution, Face in the Crowd. And for our loyal listeners, you might recall that Carl Foreman, well, at this point, Carl Foreman has already been kicked out and living in Britain. He's been blacklisted from Hollywood. And the film he wrote, The Bridge on the River Kwai, is released this year. Fantastic movie. Oh, and Canal came out the same year. Oh my gosh, you don't have to keep that in because I have nothing. But that's just such a great movie.
You are missing a huge staple in the cinematic landscape from this year, Andrew.
Probably.
Plan 9 from Outer Space from Ed Wood. It's a lot of fun.
And Stanley Kubrick releases Paths of Glory this year, which is also one of my favorite films from that director. Have you seen that?
No, it was actually on this list a long time ago. I'm curious to see it.
I forced this film onto the list early on, right?
This film being The Cranes Are Flying.
Yes.
Yes.
And I think you know why.
I believe I do.
I'm going to let you take the plot description this week.
That's great, because I wrote one out.
Oh, wonderful. We're getting better at this. Almost 40 episodes in, we're finally writing stuff down.
The Cranes Are Flying takes place in the Soviet Union right on the eve of World War II, where we meet a young and carefree couple, Veronica and Boris, completely head over heels for each other. Just a young couple in love. So you know what's coming next. When the war breaks out, Boris eagerly joins the fight at the front lines, even though Veronica wants him to stay with her. And as the fighting grows worse and worse, the cities are bombed. Veronica grows closer to Boris's cousin, a man who stayed home from the war. Veronica is essentially cornered and propositioned by the cousin and forced into a loveless marriage with him. And now feeling guilty for abandoning her love, Veronica still holds out hope that Boris has survived the battles. The years drag on, her family retreats to Siberia, and Veronica discovers that the cousin, her husband, bribed his way out of the war, and he's kicked out of the family. Even when news comes that Boris was killed in combat, Veronica holds out hope that she will see him again. When the war ends and the soldiers all return home, the realization hits Veronica that her love truly is gone. And as she grieves, she hands out flowers to other returning soldiers. Andrew, what did you think of this film?
I first watched this film actually just last year, so barely making it in under the mark of this being one I've seen before the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
But Criterion released this in March of last year, and the night I first watched it, I cried my eyes out. And it was also 2 months into the pandemic. Things were pretty fresh. And I just cried and cried and cried. And then when you approached me with this project, it was still very fresh. And that was one of the main reasons when I looked at the list, I said, we should do The Cranes Are Flying. I'm not kidding. It really was one of the first things I wanted to do, because I immediately thought I need to express the way I feel about this movie. And watching it again this week, I feel the same way. It's just a very visceral, beautiful film, unlike anything you have ever seen, not in a plot sense, in a visual sense. This movie does not look like any other film, because the types of cinematography being used in it that would be popularized later are all being done with digital cameras. This is a black and white film with just this insane eye and all of this insane technique. It verges on experimental, which you already know I'm a huge fan of. And the story it tells is so simple, but it's told so effectively that it cuts me right to my core. And I think it is one of my favorite movies.
I think that about sums it up.
Yep. What did you think? This is your first time.
Yeah, this is a great example of a film that just makes me really happy that we agreed to do this project. I'm really appreciative that you brought it up. It's a film that I never would have sought out on my own. I don't know if there'd ever be a time that I'd just say, yeah, let's turn on The Cranes Are Flying. But I'm so glad I did. It's a lovely, lovely, just intimate film. Like you said, the visuals are great. I think you could turn off the sound. You could just listen to this film as a silent film and it would all work perfectly. Because, like you said, the camera's eye is so innovative and just tells the story so well on its own.
From the very beginning, that opening shot of the bridge and it's curving against the perspective, and then we watch them walk away and become smaller and smaller as the scope of the image becomes larger, that's the movie, right? They are these insignificant figures against this wide world that has no care for them.
Yeah, pretty much immediately I realized that I was watching something really beautiful, stunning, and I was completely drawn in. The shot that really sold me on the film was when we start on a close-up with Veronica. She's getting off a bus and she's going to look for Boris as he's about to head off to war. And she pushes her way through the crowd and the camera's following her. It's all one shot. And then the camera...
It flies.
Yeah, it flies. And we see her run into the street as these tanks are barreling down the road. And the depth in each of these shots is incredible. We see all the way to the horizon, basically, lines of tanks, and you realize that this shot that started off as something so intimate, just this close-up of Veronica, has evolved into this stunning landscape of tanks rushing off to battle. It's incredible. It's incredible. And it's all, you know, in the service of a story that is so personal and just about these two people trying to let their love survive this horrible time in history. I'm at a loss for words, I think.
Wonderful.
This might be one of my favorite films that we've watched. Yeah, it's a great one for the list.
No, it made my heart skip a little beat when you sent me a text earlier this week. Because, dear listeners, we don't always communicate our feelings about a movie before we record. In fact, most of the time, it's sort of this unspoken rule between us, but we really don't discuss anything about the movie until we're recording.
That's right. So we can give you the best show possible.
Truly, it was completely unspoken, but I truly believe we both feel like, well, okay, let's wait until we're recording so we can get all of it out there. But in this particular instance, you sent me a text, I believe, on Monday saying, this was a great movie, and it just made my heart leap. I would want many more people to see it. If this project even just gets one more person to see it, then we will have succeeded. You know what I mean?
Yeah, we were saying that a lot during the silent era, but I think this is a film that's a little bit more accessible than something like A Page of Madness. No offense.
I never called that film accessible, in my defense.
No, we never claimed that.
I want to give a little bit of a history into how I discovered this film. So when I was watching The Story of Film and Odyssey, it gets to the 60s and shows this incredible sequence of a funeral parade where this coffin is being lifted by hundreds of people and paraded through the streets. And the shot is from behind a balcony. And as the coffin is moving forward in the streets, all of a sudden the camera leaves the balcony and in some magical way that does not make any sense at all, literally is flying over the scene as it follows the coffin. And when I saw that shot, I didn't cry necessarily, but I felt this surge of emotion. I had just never seen a shot like it before, and I immediately thought, well, okay, I've written down a lot of recommendations from this documentary series. This movie I want to watch this weekend. And I could not find it anywhere as far as renting it or anything, so I just bought it. It's this beautiful cigar box, is what it looks like, and the film is called Soy Cuba, which is directed by Mikhail Kalatozov. And I watched that film the day that the set came in, and I cried throughout almost the entire movie. And then Criterion released a Blu-ray of his film Letter Never Sent. And I watched that movie with James, and at the end of it, we were both crying our eyes out. And I thought, this man is a hidden treasure of cinema. Why does nobody talk about him or these movies?
He is.
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
And then when Cranes Are Flying was announced as a Blu-ray release in March of last year, I could not have been more excited. Soy Cuba, we have referenced that film on this podcast before. That is the movie that I recorded that commentary track for the other podcast.
Oh.
That's the same director.
Cool.
I wish that commentary track still existed in any way, but unfortunately it does not. Arthur, let's discuss the review from the time period.
It's our old friend, Guess Who?
Oh, Mr. Crowther. He's
Bosley
back.
Crowther.
I call him Boz. We're friends.
I was having trouble finding a review from the time period, but you can always count on typing in The Cranes Are Flying, Bosley Crowther, and his reviews will come up. This is actually a review from 1960, so 3 years after this film initially released in the Soviet Union.
He really likes it.
He really likes it, and something that I found interesting, calls the film a beautifully tender, almost lyric feeling for romantic love, so uncommon in Soviet films, which are often given to extolling patriotic fervor and the lovable qualities of hydroelectric plants. End quote. I don't know what he's talking about there with the hydroelectric plants, but I do understand what he means by patriotic fervor. The last film that we watched from the Soviet Union was all the way back in 1925, for this list anyways. That was Battleship Potemkin, which is 100% a propaganda film that feels so radically different from this. And I imagine that a lot of Soviet films were replicating that Eisensteinian feel. So this film, The Cranes Are Flying, feels like a breath of fresh air coming from Soviet cinema. That's what I've gathered from his review.
Do you feel that this film is radically different from
Battleship Potemkin?
Yes.
Oh, yes, for sure. This is a film about the individuals and their struggles.
That's true. Very true.
Whereas Battleship Potemkin, and I imagine a lot of the Soviet propaganda films that were being pushed by the state, are just effective propaganda pieces.
I just remember the main discussion we had around Battleship Potemkin was how insane all of the form and aesthetics were. And I sort of feel the same way about this film. And the cinematographer, Sergei Urasevsky, he cites Sergei Eisenstein as one of his biggest influences, specifically the film Strike.
Oh, okay, yeah. So aesthetically, this definitely feels like it's drawing from an older cinematic sensibility that was more popular during the silent era. And I think Bosley Crowther even mentions that in his review here, that there is more of a focus on telling a story through visual language. You absolutely love that. And now that we're in 1957 and the cameras aren't just these crazy monstrous things, they're getting away with some really, really fascinating tricks. I love the shot where we're following Boris as he runs up a spiral staircase and the camera is ascending the stairs with him.
Lifting and spinning. Yes. Lifting and spinning.
It's crazy.
The shot I gravitate to the most is when Boris and his fellow army man are trudging through the battlefield with all of the barbed wire in the foreground. And every time they come into frame, they come into a different corner and there is a different light source. There is a different image. They are filling the frame and using the rule of thirds, and the movement the actors are giving feels natural, and somehow it is still creating what feels like 1,000 paintings all at once right after each other. Watching that shot, it feels like there's no way to achieve it without planning it so strictly, but it also feels like there is absolutely no way you could plan it because it depends on clouds and the sun. It blows my mind.
I love all the stuff with them on the battlefront. Didn't you also love Boris's death scene, even as you were crying, as you were weeping?
Yes, his entire fantasy sequence with all of the composite images being thrown over it and the insanity of how fast his mind is reeling as he dies.
I remember us mentioning that we loved a lot of the images in Battleship Potemkin as well. And there's a montage of her, Veronica, running through the trees that feels very much like it's from an Eisenstein film.
Yes.
So yes, aesthetically very similar to what we might expect from Soviet cinema, but comparing the themes and the story itself to past Soviet cinema, I can see why this was a radical departure. And we've mentioned in some of our little history follow-ups in the past couple of episodes, if you'll remember that Stalin recently died and the Soviet Union was freed from his cult of personality. And now Nikita Khrushchev is in charge of the Soviet Union. He's actually denounced a lot of Stalin's policies. So you see that in the Soviet Union, there's this new day dawning. I think they actually call it the thaw, where the country is becoming more open to new ideas. Filmmakers don't need to fear for their lives. They can actually start to express themselves and put out work like this, that before the war was only portrayed in a positive light. And now we can start to explore the real effects that it had on individuals back home, the women who were left behind. And so you can see why this is a big deal.
Yes.
And it becomes a bigger deal once you start to dig into the history of the country it came from. And that also makes it very special. And another reason why I really like this project is analyzing the context that films were made in makes you appreciate them more.
Absolutely.
It's worth noting that in the Soviet Union, they don't call World War II World War II. It's called the Great Patriotic War.
Why do you think that is?
I'm not in any position to say for certain, but I know there are historical connotations that are just separate from the world wars. When Napoleon tried to invade Russia, that conflict was called the Patriotic War, I believe. And you got to remember that World War I did not go very well for Russia and the Soviet Union. It was a kind of catastrophic failure, and Russia as a society sort of collapsed and became the Soviet Union because of all of the hardships they were facing because of the war. So they might want to separate it from that conflict. But yeah, it's specifically referring to the Eastern Front, what we consider the Eastern Front of World War II, the conflict between the Nazis and the Soviet Union. So I imagine it's a way to drum up patriotic support for the war, something to be very proud of. And even this film is very proud of Russia's involvement in the war. The cousin who sort of weasels his way out of fighting in the war, he's a coward. He's a coward in society's eyes.
Yeah, he sucks.
We could probably mention almost every scene in this film as a visual marvel, but the scene with the bombing of the apartment with the lights flashing as he probably rapes Veronica?
He absolutely does.
Yes. Is another stunning sequence, yes.
I distinctly remember watching it the first time and being so invested in the beauty of it. And then as he starts banging on the piano, I was thinking, man, this is so much more aggressive than other things that have happened in the film. And then just when I'm thinking that, all of a sudden a air raid starts and lights are flashing everywhere. And I'm thinking, oh, I am being bombarded. That is what's happening. It started with the piano and now it's the whole set. And then she is violated and you as an audience member feel violated because the scene is so intense and it isn't graphic. One of the things that I take away from that scene is just how tastefully done that subject is. It doesn't portray it in a way that I feel makes it a film that people couldn't watch. It gets the concept across, but the whole thing is done with this camera trickery and these crazy lighting setups and this oppressive sound design. So the feeling that she has is the feeling you as an audience have from the movie itself. And I think that's a very clever way to get across that concept.
So that how does the Soviet Union's perspective on the war differ from the other perspectives we watched for this podcast?
I guess the main takeaway from it for me was this feels way more personal, which is really interesting considering it's coming from the Soviet Union.
Right.
What are the other war films you've watched?
Other World War II centered films that we watched would include Rome Open City from Italy and The Best Years of Our Lives from the United States.
So this film seems to be far more interested in the people who are back home. The Best Years of Our Lives does take place in the home front, but it is after the war. And Rome Open City, of course, takes place in the city that is being occupied and is under attack. This film, while the city they're in definitely is under attack, is more about how the citizens are working together while the men are out at war, which I think does fit into a certain communist mindset of showing how the people work together to get through the situation together.
Oh, that's true. Yeah.
I really like the sense of established community within the film. Even the rapport between the doctor, he's not technically her father-in-law. He might as well be her father-in-law, and the patients in the hospital. The way he's able to rouse a speech in front of them, which is devastating for her to hear. However, it is what those soldiers need to hear in that moment to be able to overcome their emotional grief. I really like that there's this sense of working together and understanding each other within this film that is understood and is a thread through the whole film. And all of the conflict comes from people misunderstanding and unable to trust in each other. That's kind of how I feel.
Yeah,
Was that
yeah.
good? Was that good?
Yeah,
I don't know. Was that good?
No, I think that was good.
Okay.
Well, just to add on to something you said, I love how when the camera drifts through the crowd shots, when we see other people, we get glimpses into all of these little stories.
Yes.
You know, the extras aren't just people kind of wandering around. You can tell that there was a lot of thought and direction put into every single face that the camera sees. Again, that feels like something that Soviet cinema would really latch on to.
When that huge panning shot happened where Boris is slowly getting swallowed by the crowd, and we are focusing on 100 different faces as the camera pans past, probably my favorite comment of the night from my roommates watching it with me. Justin just said, "Did you all see that newly single mother?" And I said, I did. And he said, "She looked crestfallen." He really latched on to a whole story just from this quick shot. Well, the shot isn't quick, but a quick image going through a shot. And the film is filled with moments like that.
Yeah, it's great.
I love that aspect of this film. That there are a million little stories happening in the background, individualizing these people, which again is just kind of shocking considering it's coming from the Soviet Union in 1957. I guess when I say shocking, I don't mean that the film is approaching that subject as much as that the Soviet Union would let them approach that subject and would let them display it.
Right, because we're coming out of the Stalin years. And apparently, I don't know too much about this, Khrushchev does clamp down on the free expression that filmmakers have as time goes on. So this is a period in Soviet cinema where you do see stories like this for a time.
And this film had a nice festival run and a very small distribution in other countries, including the US, over the next 5 years. However, eventually, once Khrushchev does make those calls when it comes to films, these movies are kind of lost to American culture. It wasn't until 95 that Martin Scorsese saw a screening of Soy Cuba with no subtitles. That folds into your whole idea that you could watch this film without audio and it would still be so compelling.
Oh, that's interesting.
And he saw it in a theater. Francis Ford Coppola was there as well. And that was actually the film that sort of kicked off Scorsese's secondary career as a film restorationist. Restorationist? Is that a word? It sounds great. I'm going to keep it.
You're good.
So it really wasn't until very, very recently that we've been able to see these films from Kalatozov.
That's so interesting, too, because I saw in the Bosley Crowther review that he mentions The Cranes Are Flying as part of the cultural exchange agreement promoted by the Soviet Union and the United States Department of State. So this was actually a film that was brought over in a larger project that was trying to bridge the divide, the Iron Curtain that had formed between the West and the Soviet Union. I couldn't find any other films that were included in that cultural exchange agreement, but I do find that so fascinating that the Soviet Union was using this film to try to present some understanding to Western culture. That exchange agreement is most famous for a debate that happens between Khrushchev and Nixon, where they're standing in a fake kitchen and they're talking about American kitchen appliances or something like this. It's very strange.
Wait, is this available to watch?
Yes.
It
goes on for quite a while. It's like a long sort of like awkward talk between the two of them. Yeah. And that's why you have Bosley Crowther's review of this in 1960, because it was part of that whole program.
Yes, I had figured that much, that we weren't going to be able to find a review from the year itself, as any Soviet publication or criticism would be very difficult for us to find.
Yes, yes. Now, you told me that this film was celebrated upon release by women in the Soviet Union. How do you think this film approaches gender?
I love her character, played brilliantly by Tatiana Samoilova, who we are very fortunate to have in this film. She had done one other film prior called The Mexican, but allegedly she had such a horrible time on that set and making that film that she declared she would never make another film. And I don't know the exact details of how she got cast in this film by Kalatozov, but I know it wasn't easy for him to get her on it. But she's so terrific in this role. It's an incredible performance.
Wonderful. You can tell she has a spirit that you just want to watch.
I really like that she is so layered. She is a victim to a certain extent, but she also takes ownership for her life. She has to suffer just as much as any of the men at war do. That's sort of the whole point of this film, is showing how this woman who would never have gone to war in the first place is also completely ripped apart by this war. She almost kills herself by throwing herself in front of a train, which is interesting because she plays Anna Karenina in a very famous adaptation of that novel from Russia in the 60s. So, and spoiler alert for Anna Karenina, I guess. I don't know. I don't know if people know what that is. However, she is able to recover. The sequence where the man is preaching to the soldiers about how the women who married other men while they were at war are cowards who are beneath them, and she is forced to take it all personally. We already have learned that Boris's entire family looks down on her because of her decision, and she's more or less aware of that fact. We don't know if they've ever had a one-on-one discussion. However, when the father is giving that rousing speech to the man, and it seems to be coming out of nowhere, you as an audience member, and therefore Veronica as a character, are both completely aware that these are thoughts that he's had about her specifically and is now expressing in this room to all of these men. She is forced to evaluate everything about herself and her life and her choices, and then she's able to take complete agency of her life. And I love it. I love it so much. It's such a phenomenal character arc, reaching her lowest point and slowly climbing her way out. You really think at the beginning of the film this is going to be some sort of tortured love story about these two souls. But Boris really just does not have anywhere near as much screen time as Veronica does.
No, it's
not
her
even
story.
Close. It is very much her story about how she had to survive this war in the same way that any man who went to war did. And I think a lot of women... So she received a watch during a German film festival, which she won Best Actress at. And the watch was inscripted with the quote, "Finally, we see on the Soviet screen a face, not a mask." And I think that that's very appropriate. She isn't a part of the crowd. She isn't a part of some major group. She isn't even the face of a group. She is her own face. She is her own character. What did you think this film stated as far as gender was concerned?
It all holds up, doesn't it? This
Yeah.
is a film that feels really ahead of its time, especially when looking at American films from the 1950s, which I believe I've stated a couple times were just terrible as far as their depiction of women. Most of the women in the films we've been watching have been serving coffee and going around asking the men if they want any.
Yes. Or they've been getting punched and thrown down a hill.
Yeah, The Searchers. That film has not sat well with me.
Noah was the only roommate who watched The Searchers with me.
Okay.
And when the Cranes Are Flying was over, we were talking about how gorgeous it was. And I said, people love The Searchers and say it's so gorgeous. But then you watch something like this, and it is even more gorgeous, even more interesting to watch, and just a better film. And you think, why isn't this considered one of the greatest films of all time? Why isn't this in the top 10 sight and sound?
Stop. You're breaking my heart.
And yes, it has not sat well with me, and watching this film again made me realize that it can't even be fully blamed to be a product of its time, because this film came out the year after and was in production at the same time and does not share those insanely problematic elements, even though it is approaching very touchy subjects such as non-consensual sex, the shaming of women who have cheated on men. It is approaching very tense subjects that people could take very personally, and it has a very deft hand behind it, and it has intention behind everything. So just to circle back to last week's episode, The Searchers does not get a pass. It just does not.
I don't think history will be kind to The Searchers.
No, I think history will be very kind to Kalatozov. I think we are right on the precipice of him becoming an extremely acclaimed director in cinema circles all around the world.
I would love that, but I don't believe it.
I believe it. I believe that we are one incredible Blu-ray release away of Soy Cuba from that happening.
Well, I'll keep that in the podcast so we have a record of it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a good transition to talk about the director and cinematographer of this film. Andrew, I think you got that.
Mikhail Kalatozov and Sergei Urasevsky, they worked together on only 3 films. They are the 3 films I've seen. Kalatozov has one other movie from this period of his career that was not shot by him, and it stars Sean Connery. And I want to see it very badly, but it's impossible to find. And those 3 films, as I've already mentioned, are The Cranes Are Flying, Letter Never Sent, and Soy Cuba. They all have this insane perspective. He loved just holding the camera. You mentioned earlier the shot where we start on Veronica, slowly walk through a crowd, and then the crane takes it up. Do you know that that's not actually a crane shot, technically?
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that.
Sergei Urasevsky is holding the camera. He is following her. He's in on her. And then he puts it on his lap very gently so it stays steady, sits on a platform, and the platform is raised while he's sitting on it.
Damn, that is professional.
There is a sequence in Letter Never Sent where the forest they are trapped in is set on fire. And there is BTS footage of it that's in color. And Urasevsky is just covered in asbestos and all this padding, and he's just running through the flaming forest that is literally on fire with a camera. And that's how that scene was shot.
Jeez.
He was a professional. He put his life on the line to make his art, and it shows on that screen. There is no movie that looks like these movies. They don't even look like each other. They all tell a different story and express themselves in different ways. Soy Cuba has this incredible sequence. It's one of the earliest shots in the film where you go through an entire club, go outside of the window of a club, and then go up the entire side of the wall until you reach the roof and realize the club is still going on the roof of the building. And while it's going up the side of the building, you're seeing the desolation of Cuba outside of this nightclub made for the wealthy. So we get a sort of peek into what the real world is like as we're climbing the wall, and then we swing back in and it's back to the wealthy people partying. So his shots always do things like that, where not only is the form impressive and you are wondering, how the hell did you do this? How did you make this movie? On top of that, you are so stunned by the poetry on display. Every image is telling a story and is giving you something to chew on and something to think about. Oh, it's just what cinema is made to do.
And again, those shots all sound like they would have been impossible with the giant camera setups that we see in Hollywood productions.
Yes. Did you notice during Veronica's escape from the hospital when she is contemplating suicide, that quick shot that's been sped up where it's just her legs running?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So, of course, the way it's filmed is she's just holding the camera close to her chest and running. But even that is just such a fun idea. They were on set. That was not a part of the storyboarding or anything. And they had this idea to make this very manic sequence, and they wanted to do all of these crazy shots. And just for part of it, he handed her the camera and said, point it just like this and just run. And that's what she did. And it looks great.
I don't want to turn this podcast into us just describing every shot of the film.
But
even though we could. But yeah, this is one of those tough ones where I just want to talk about how much I love all the images, but really you need to watch the movie to understand it.
Yes.
We're a podcast, we're an audio medium. Go watch the movie.
But, you know, if they did watch the movie and they're listening to this, they get to hear these tidbits on how they made the shots.
Oh, for sure, for sure.
It's all good. People love it.
What should we talk about next? I'm looking through our list.
I put it in sort of as a joke, why are Russian films so freaking good? But dude, why? I watched that. I know I've made a joke about this film on this podcast, but I watched that 7-hour War and Peace movie last year, and I thought, this is the most entertaining and beautiful 7-hour film ever made. This is a movie I could show somebody, in chunks, of course, but show anybody, and they would be entertained and gripped by it. They have a sense for pacing for the art form in Russia that still to this day has not communicated effectively in America. That is my true feeling. You watch a Tarkovsky film where plot-wise, nothing happens for 2 hours straight, and yet you are compelled to keep your eyes glued to the screen. Every word of dialogue seems to somehow tear into you a little bit. I don't understand how it happens or where it came from within Russian culture, that Russian film has this motivation to have poetry in the imagery. It doesn't feel like any shot should ever be wasted, or this is the reason we're doing this is for this. It's always, we have to tell a story with every single image on this screen. And I don't know how that concept came about.
You know what? I think that, and real film historians, real film scholars, please feel free to tell me I'm completely wrong, but I'm wondering if it's coming from the same sense of competition that drove something like the space race, that the Soviet Union just wants to pour money into the arts to be the best of the best in this medium. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Because look, the beginning of this film starts with not the credits for the film, but all the awards it's won, right?
And a headshot.
Yeah, of the director. Just this very proud Soviet exceptionalism that I could probably criticize, but you can tell that they're very proud of their artwork.
Just the opening shot, as soon as the movie starts, you think, oh yeah, give it every award, for sure.
Yeah, you're like, it's all deserved. This film swept at Cannes.
Yeah, I just really find myself drawn to Russian cinema, and I love whatever the concept behind making art is as far as film goes. I love it. And I do wish it existed in other countries to the same degree, and I do wish there were more films that followed this weird unspoken set of rules that they have. But also, I do love that it's just this sort of characteristic of this country and the film it puts out.
Could also be artists trying to speak out against tyranny in their country. I know for a long time during World War II and afterwards, Stalin's totalitarian policies were really stifling cinema in the Soviet Union, so that it's almost like when that was lifted, there was this explosion of artistic output. Mm-hmm. You could say that. Again, real film historians, please correct me. I don't know.
I'm going to start taking it personally that you don't consider me a real film historian.
You might as well be, the amount of films you've seen and the research
what else
done.
have I been devoting my entire life to? My credentials speak for themselves.
All right, so I think our thoughts on this film have been well stated throughout the episode. I adore it. It's one of the best films we've watched in this century in cinema list that was put together way back when. So thank you, Andrew, for having me include it.
And thank you again for reaching out with the project, because, again, it was just the timing was so perfect. And this movie was so fresh. And I was thinking, well, if we're going to do this, then whenever we get to 1957, we have to do The Cranes Are Flying, because I'm still crying about it right now.
And as a baby filmmaker, I do think it's so important to dig into the classics and really look at films that inspire you, find new stories that surprise you, and just make you want to make good films. I'm really happy I saw this.
Yeah, getting to watch it with the roommates last night was so nice. They all loved it, and throughout the whole thing, there were just moments where they would go, "This is fantastic. This is amazing." It just, throughout the whole movie, there would just be moments where people would say, "This is incredible," you know. Like it's just one of those movies, you know. There are just so many scenes where, while you're watching it, you're thinking, "This is the best thing I've ever watched."
Yeah, lovely. I feel like that was great. I feel like that's going to make a great episode.
I agree. So next week for 1958, we will be watching Invention for Destruction, directed by Karel Zeman. It's kind of an acid trip, half animated, half live action movie. I am so excited for your opinion on this.
Yes, it looks so fun.
It's a very fun movie, and we will be joined by my friend Tara. She is a graphic artist in Salt Lake City, and she has done a lot of research in art history, and
that sounds
so it feels like she needs to be on here with us. When I first watched the film, she was there with me, and we had a great time, so I'm very excited for her to join us next week.
Cool, I can't wait to meet her.
Yeah, it was great.
That's all we got. I just want to give a shout out to all our Patreon members who keep the show running. Thank you all. You too can become a patron and get access to bonus episodes linked down in the show notes. You're listening on YouTube now, so like and subscribe and comment down below. Tell us if you've seen the film. What did you think of it? Did we miss anything? Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you for the next one.